So Steve, I'm still confused though. I'm still confused, and this is where I'm confused, and I want to understand the Catholic standpoint on it. So
Mhm.
is the purpose of possession from that standpoint? Is the demonic entity trying to absolutely destroy that person, body and soul? Is it trying to
Pretty
get
much.
that person to give up its faith out of despair? Is it trying to like steal that soul? Is it trying to is it trying to inhabit that body so that it can be human, it can function like a human? And if that is so, that can't be right because it's destroying the body that it's in. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is where I'm just like, no, wait, what is the function of the behavior? I want to do an FBA on a demon. You know what I'm saying?
And
What
that is the hardest
is
question of the whole thing.
behavior? What's the end goal? Is it to get everybody in that person's family to despair? Is it to get that person to despair? Is it like is it feeding, or is it chaos and destruction? Right? Is it
Mhm.
trying to destroy the opposite of itself? Like anything like life, love, hope, um, all of those things. Is that the purpose? What is the purpose for, and like what's interesting to me is that you see stories of this in all different cultures, not just the Catholic culture and not just the Catholic religion, all different religions, all different cultures, not even necessarily religions. So, and sometimes the patterns are similar and sometimes they're not. So I mean, you're the world religion man. So like from what you've studied, what patterns do you see when you have studied this in different from different cultures or religions? And then what is there anything to glean from that, like the patterns that you see cross cultures? Do you know what I mean? And the big question is like, just tell me like what the Catholics think about this, because that is something they skipped over. The nuns skipped way over. The
Oh,
closest we
absolutely.
got was is the stance from the Catholic perspective, and then what are the patterns that you see across the religions that you've studied or cultures that you've studied? Those are my two questions for you.
So this will be a longer answer.
Sorry, got it.
So everything that you said is true. Like all those different aims of a possessing spirit. And there's different classes of demons, basically. And if you get into like the medieval demonology, if you get into that kind of shit, they are identified by like their ranks. So like there's seven archangels, there's seven like arch demons that oppose them, usually associated with the seven deadly sins. So like Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, is associated with the sin of lust, for example. And Belphegor is like the archdemon of gluttony and sloth, whatever, sloth, if you want to be British. And each one of them has a different demon associated with it. And it's a parallel. It's kind of like if my phone is like the middle ground, the structure built up is the angels, and the one that mirrors it down the other way is the way the demons are organized. So, depending on what type of demon you're actually dealing with, its goals will be very different, and its powers will be very different as well. And when people say they're possessed by Satan himself, that's obviously going to be the most powerful one. Something you might find interesting, we usually conflate Lucifer and Satan together, but in a lot of demonological texts, they're very different entities. They're two different dudes, essentially. And sometimes we call Belial another name of the devil. Belial is a different guy. Like there's a bunch of different ones. And once again, they all have different powers. They all have different means of subduing you and trying to break you down, essentially. So all of those different purposes that you mentioned of what demons might do are basically determined on what type of demon you're actually dealing with. And there is a whole very elaborate classification system, because everything in the church is very, very neatly organized. That's something that they definitely got right. Now, if you want to talk about other religions, you have a couple different types of spirit possession that can happen. So in Islam, for example, you have the jinn, or the jinn, if you want to be American. Genies, if you want to bastardize it and put it in a kid's movie. In Islam, these jinn are not necessarily good or bad. They are just like human beings. They have free will, except they don't have a physical body. They're a spiritual entity. Now, angels and, evil jinn, different types of demons do exist, but the typical jinn is just basically a disembodied human spirit. But there are a bunch of types of jinn. And sometimes you'll have a jinn possession where a jinn that can be good or bad will take a person's body for, to accomplish some specific thing. They have unfinished business, or maybe they have business they never had a chance to attend. So they'll possess a person and then accomplish whatever, and then they'll leave. Or other times you have to call in the exorcist to get them to leave. And I don't know too much of the specifics of the Islamic exorcism. I think it's largely because they don't really have a set ritual as Catholics do. But the exorcist will basically talk to the jinn and figure out what it wants. And then sometimes that's very hostile. And other times it's much more, they can have a conversation and come to terms without really needing to fight. Now in Judaism, you have the Dybbuk, that is the most familiar type of possessing spirit. The Dybbuk box. Okay, the Dybbuk is basically someone who has died who has some kind of malicious intent. Somebody is killed, unjustly, for example. They want revenge. So they will linger around on the earth and they will find a host to feed on. Now, the Dybbuk is explicitly feeding on the person. That's a distinctive feature of this type of spirit. And what the word Dybbuk actually is derived from is the Hebrew that means to attach, because its whole purpose is that it clings to the person like a leech and basically sucks their life force. And that's what happens in that movie, The Possession. The way it works is that the Dybbuk attaches to the person, sucks them dry, and then when they die, leaves and finds a new host to feed on. It's a parasite, basically. It's a very negative and a very evil kind of thing. There's some question on whether it's originally a human spirit or whether it's always a demon. And I think it depends on, it always depends with these things. And I think it just depends on the circumstance, because there are demons in Judaism, although not perhaps as we recognize them. You get into the Eastern religions, I talk about Hinduism the most. I know I talked about this once before a while ago, that the demons and the gods are not necessarily always good and evil in the Puranas and the scriptures. So there are stories of particularly wicked demon kings. And somebody was talking about portals and kind of crossings earlier. And this is fitting. There's a story in the Vishnu Purana about the demon king Hiranyakashipu, which is a Sanskrit word meaning he who is cloaked in gold or something like that. And Hiranyakashipu is very powerful. He's very arrogant as a result of it. Because what he does is that he seeks out the creator god Brahma. And he goes to Lord Brahma and he asks for a blessing, a boon, as it were. And Brahma basically tells him, no, I'm not impressed enough with your penance. Your austerity is not severe. Because the way that you get things from the gods in like ancient Hindu traditions is that you perform various austerities. Hiranyakashipu goes to Brahma and asks for a boon, and Brahma tells him, no, I'm not impressed with you. So he goes off and he journeys into the mountains, and he fasts and prays for many years. And, because these are celestial beings, they live for a very long time. So he can go and fast and pray in the story for 1,000 years, and it's not a big deal. That's just part of how these stories go. So he goes back to Brahma and he says, I've been offering sacrifice to you. I've been fasting. I've been doing all this shit for all these years. Will you give me my blessing now? And Brahma is very pleased with him. And he says, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he says, make me a god. And Brahma says, no, I can't do that one. Try again. So he says, okay, how about this? Make it so that I can't be killed by any man nor any beast. Make it so that I can't be killed by hand or by a weapon. Make it so that I can't be killed inside the house or outside the house. And make it so that I can't be killed during the day or at night. Basically making himself invincible. So Brahma says, I'll grant you that. And he inherits this power from the creator god, the lord of creatures, Brahma himself. So Hiranyakashipu abuses the shit out of his newfound power. He forbids the worship of God. In this story, Vishnu is God because it's the Vishnu Purana. Who God is changes depending on which text you read. It's a major difference between Hinduism and Christianity, where, Jesus is God in every Christian text. Different Hindu text, different person is God. So he bans the worship of Vishnu from the land. And he kills everyone that goes to the temple to offer sacrifices to God and to do all the things they're supposed to do, to uphold their dharma, essentially. And finally, Hiranyakashipu's own son, is raised by the divine sage to worship God. And Hiranyakashipu becomes very furious with this. And he tries to kill his own son throughout all these different increasingly bizarre methods. But in each case, Vishnu intervenes and protects him because Prahlad, his son, is very faithful. And no matter what the evil king does, Prahlad is always able to maintain his faith. And what's important here is that Prahlad is a demon, just as his father is. One is good, one is evil. They're not always evil in here. So anyway, end of the story. Hiranyakashipu tries everything to kill his son because he's sick of his son not worshiping him as God. He wants to take Vishnu out of the picture. So he fails again and again. And finally, he brings his son into the palace and he's going to reprimand him in front of everyone. And he tells him, it's ridiculous that you still worship this other guy. I'm the king of all the three worlds. I am immortal. I am all powerful. And he runs down his own son. And finally, he points to a pillar in the palace. And he says, you keep telling me that this Vishnu guy is everywhere. Is he in this pillar? And everybody's standing there. And Prahlad is undeterred, but everybody's laughing at him. When lo and behold, the pillar bursts open. And a bizarre creature known as Narasimha, the man lion, emerges from it. So God has taken the shape of a half man, half lion creature. And he proceeds to beat the shit out of Hiranyakashipu and disembowel him. So the way he does this is that he takes the evil demon king to the doorway of the palace at sunset. And I missed the part where he says, I can't be killed on the ground or in the air. He sets the king on his knee, and then he rips him open with the claws on his fingers, and he kills him. So he finds a way around all the restrictions the king put on his own immortality. long story short, in that tradition, you have good and bad demons. Okay. And I think I mentioned it once before, but the qualification of what makes you a demon is actually who your parents are. It's not, like what class of being you are, whatever. The children of one particular goddess are the devas, the gods, and the children that are not of her are the demons. Okay. So that's that one. You don't really have demons in Buddhism because you don't really have God in Buddhism until you get into like Tibetan Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism, where you basically just take the folk religion of that place and put Buddhist principles into it. But you do have it in like Taoism and things like that, where there are evil spirits that are just out in the world. And the priest is someone that is able to figure out how to get them to leave a family alone. I didn't tell you about Hindu exorcism. That was the whole point of the fucking conversation. So, my thesis advisor studied in India for a while when he was a younger man full of hopes and dreams. And he told me of 2 times where he saw something very strange. And every time I meet a new priest, once I start to get to know him, I always ask him if he's been involved with an exorcism. It's just something that I inevitably do. And they all tell me no. But we got to the end of writing my thesis, and we were just sitting in his office bullshitting the one day. And this came up, because it always comes up. And I just asked him, like, when you were in India, did you ever see anything weird? And he stopped and he laughed nervously, and he's like, there were 2 things I saw that were very strange, that really made me question. And he said the first was where he was speaking to an exorcist at a temple. Like they were there, just doing whatever. And the exorcist of the village came in and they said like, oh, Father, you should talk to him. And he was talking to this Hindu exorcist who basically said, when a person's possessed by a spirit, my job is to talk to the spirit and figure out what it's trying to gain from doing this. And when we can figure out what it wants, we can work something out and I can get it to leave. The other one was when he was in a temple one time and there was someone there who was ecstatic. This kind of goes back to what Alex was asking about speaking in tongues like 2 hours ago. And I'll talk about that and then I'll let someone else talk because I could just go all night, obviously. He went to this temple where there was someone who was, in an ecstatic state who was speaking in tongues. And the way he described it to me was that it was a guy dressed in drag who was speaking in a woman's voice, like a young guy speaking with an old woman's voice and talking about like whatever. And he said it freaked him the fuck out so bad that he just left. And the people told him like this happens now and again where somebody will be moved by this spirit to speak and say these certain things. And, we look at it as a good thing. We look at it as a message from God rather than as a bad thing. So what that has to do with your original question is that in a lot of Christian churches, notably Pentecostalism, they believe that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, is actively taking part in these worship ceremonies. And the way that he does this is that he speaks through people. So if you watch those shows where it's like a mega church or whatever, it comes on at like 5:30 in the morning if you flip through the channels. There's like 20,000 people sitting around as a guy does faith healings. And there's conveniently someone who's blind, and as soon as he blesses them in the name of Christ, they're not blind anymore. You've all seen those things, I'm sure. They get a good rating. They make a lot of money. And that's why they're still a thing. So speaking in tongues is often a part of those, where it's kind of like a badge of honor where people in those churches will want to speak in tongues. And they'll want to have God speak through them and all that. And maybe I'm just biased because I'm Catholic, But every time I've seen someone speak in tongues, it was not the Holy Spirit. And how can you know the difference? The short answer is just listen to what they're saying, and you'll know the difference when you hear it. Because the Spirit of God wouldn't say the kind of things that an evil spirit would. So,
can't you like also hear it in the tone of voice sometimes? Because like it's different than their normal tone too.
it's not the person speaking,
Yeah.
basically. And that's something that, it's very hard to describe unless you witness it, I guess you could say.
The second one I want to bring up, I have not actually personally seen or know anything about the exorcism of Anna Uklund. I don't know how you pronounce that, but for her first 14 years, Anna appeared to be a normal 19th century girl raised by her German Catholic immigrant father in Wisconsin after her mother died when Anna was young, but after her 14th birthday in 1896, ooh, this is a long time ago, Anne changed. She refused to enter the church or take communion because became sickened at the thought of holy water and engaged in what were described as unspeakable sexual acts, which we also saw in the movie The Exorcist 2 with Reagan. Starting in 1912, Anna underwent several exorcisms spanning 14 years, during which she reportedly erupted into fits of rage, vomiting tobacco leaf-like material, spoke in multiple languages, collapsed in bed, shrieking, "Hell, hell, hell." As she aged, the fits subsided, suggesting that may have had less to do with Satan, more to do with a misunderstood teenage rebellion and possibly abuse by her father. Her story got the Hollywood treatment in the 2016 The Exorcism of Anne Eklund. So that is pretty interesting because they are taking, 2016, which is still relatively recent in now times, and comparing it to a situation that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I feel like we can't even judge that one just simply because of the fact that that was like a whole other society, belief system, and just overall culture. So we will just leave that one up to that. So before we end things, I figured I'd kind of wrap it up since we, talked about the religious aspect of everything, and we talked a little bit about movies to give us some some evidence or examples of how the two have intertwined. So what better way than to take the three most iconic exorcism movies and talk about the true facts that were behind them, or true stories that may or may not have occurred. So the movie The Exorcist, or more or less the book The Exorcist, was based on a 14-year-old American boy named Roland Doe. That was kind of his pseudonym. The character was then switched to a girl in the 1973 film. Was suspected he was possessed by the devil because his family claimed furniture would fly and vases would levitate around him. He spoke in a guttural voice and couldn't stand religious objects. During a series of exorcisms in the late 1940s, the words evil, hell, and an X would appear on his body. His mattress would shook, and he'd become violent, slashing the arm of one priest, breaking the nose of another, until it all stopped forever. Some of the supposed witnesses' account may also have been exaggerated and outright inventions. Others have suggested the boy suffered mental illness aggravated by his grief over the death of his beloved aunt, a Ouija board playing specialist or spiritualist. Now, that kind of sounds a little suspicious to me, and it sounds like they did incorporate a lot of this in the movie. I don't know so much about the book because I haven't read it yet, I'm sorry, but how they were trying to say that Reagan was just suffering from mental disorder. That kind of plays into the true story on whether or not it was a real life possession or if it was just mental disorder, and unfortunately we will not know. But the ending fact of the fact that he was grieving over his beloved aunt, who was a Ouija board playing spiritualist, kind of gives me the EBGBs, but we'll kind of leave that one there. And finally, last but not least, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, one of my, it's horrible to say, favorites of these types of movies. You have Anneliese Michel. In her teens and early 20s, this German woman stopped entering churches because the grounds under her feet would burn like fire. She hallucinated, heard voices, and told her she was damned and would rot in hell, and suffered seizures. Diagnosed with epilepsy and depression, Michel did not respond to psychiatric medication, and her family became convinced she was possessed by the devil. I was talking about this one earlier when I mentioned in 1975, when she was 24, Michel underwent a brutal year-long exorcism to purge her of the dark forces, but instead it left her malnourished and dehydrated. She died in 1976, severely underweight, with pneumonia, broken knees from constant genuflecting. Her parents and the two priests were found guilty of neglect, homicide, and sentenced to 6 months in jail terms. That was reduced to 3 years of probation. Her tale was the basis of the 2005 film The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which had a happy ending where she was all fine and dandy, just like all these other ones, and unlike a lot of the true cases in which they did not have happy endings. So what we can take from this is, obviously, movies you take with a serious grain of salt, and to do further research, but also to keep your minds open, because at this point, to this day, we still do not know whether or not these exorcisms were due to real life possessions, or was it just the unfortunate misunderstanding of mental health? And we will hopefully at one point in time be able to reason with this and hopefully help prevent it, because I cannot imagine how these poor souls felt.